In this PowerPoint, I'll be covering the noun system in the Greek language. Just as a reminder, we need to, like we did with verbs, we need to go back and review some English grammar regarding nouns to kind of give us a foundation for understanding Greek nouns. In English, the subject refers to the word that is performing the action of a verb. So in this example here, the woman is the subject, and she is the one who is performing the action touched his cloak. Now, in the English sentence, cloak is functioning as a direct object, receiving the action of the verb. But the woman is the subject, and then cloak is the direct object, which is the word that receives the action of the verb. And then we have a pronoun preceding cloak showing whose cloak it is, right? It's a possessive pronoun in English. The possessive case is slightly different from the possessive pronoun, though they're similar because it's showing possession. This is a case that often in English would have either an apostrophe s or the addition of the preposition or conjunction of the word of God. Whose word? God's word is what it's telling us. So sometimes we might ask that question, whose object are we referring to, or and it will indicate possession. In English, we do have indirect objects as well as those direct objects that we just covered. And the indirect object is the word that is not directly affected, or is rather indirectly affected by the action of the verb. So in the example sentence here, this is the way it will be for those who hoard things for themselves. So for themselves is sort of giving some additional information, and in English we have a complete sentence, who hoard things. We could stop the sentence right there. But for themselves is giving us additional information, and it's indirectly affected by the action of the verb. In English, we tend to, though we may not always be aware of it because if English is our native language or our first language, then we may not be as aware of the grammar that we are using at all times. But in English, word order is what primarily determines how a noun functions in a sentence. So woman as the subject here is towards the beginning of the sentence. It precedes the verb, and then the direct object will come after the verb in English. Greek does it a little different. And in fact, there are times that word order occurs similar to English, but in general, Greek determines the case of a particular noun or a word determines the function that that noun serves in the sentence. Now let me explain case to you a little bit more. Greek has something called inflection, and that's when the form of the word, so we saw this with verbs, and it might have been a little overwhelming, but in nouns as well, there are all sorts of forms of changes that occur to the words, the form of the words, and those changes are what indicate the function and meaning in a sentence of that word. Now, because we are using Greek tools, we will not be learning all of those changes. So you can be grateful for that because there are quite a few. But that said, without having learned those, we again will be reliable or reliant upon Bible works to tell us what those parsings are for what the case is for the noun that we're looking at, or for the words that we're looking at. We are dependent and reliant upon Bible works to give us that information. Now we still have to know though what to do with the information that we have at our hands. So that's why we're covering this information. In English, similar thing happens with personal pronouns where there are different uses for she or her or I or me, depending upon whether I am the subject or me might be referring to the direct object. So we do have some changes akin to the Greek changes that a word might undergo in this inflection to show us the function of that word in the sentence. But Greek is highly inflected. In the Greek language, there are three declensions, and that is the pattern of inflection that happens for nouns. So there are three noun declensions, or patterns of changes. The first declension, and if we were learning these, we would learn them in these categories, so that when we heard the title first declension, that tells us a lot of information. Okay, but that may not be the case in this class. But what we need to know is that there are three different patterns. First declension are those nouns that that have a stem ending in alpha or eta, and these are primarily feminine nouns. In the second declension, nouns end with a stem ending in omicron, and those tend to be masculine or neuter, and they're actually probably the most common, I would say. First declension nouns are the second common, and then third declension nouns are the least common, though there are quite a few of them. And now those are nouns with a stem ending in a consonant. The case of a noun, based on tells us basically how that word is functioning or performing in a sentence. Is it the subject? Is it the direct object? Is it the indirect object? Nouns, like verbs, have number. It can be singular or plural. And the reason that verbs have number, singular or plural, is because that subject is embedded in the verb, remember? Nouns also have gender, and that can be masculine, feminine, or neuter. And now, Greek nouns are kind of like French language, if you've ever learned any French language, and I believe German is that way as well, where nouns show up in a particular gender, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything to that association. So like basileia is the word for church. Well, that doesn't mean basileia ends in an alpha, and feminine nouns often do, though some neuter nouns end in an alpha. But because basileia is a feminine noun doesn't mean that the church is feminine, right? So there's not necessarily an association related to that gender as much as it is a function or a form of the word. There are four basic cases in Greek, okay? And some of these are similar to English. There is a nominative case, which when we hear nominative is referring to the subject of the sentence. Now, there are times where the nominative occurs in the end of the sentence, and it's in the nominative case, and it often is combined with a to be verb. In that instance, you can have a predicate nominative as well. The genitive case is typically of possession. That's where we start. Now there are quite a few, like the verbs, the use of the verbs where we had like a punctiliar type of verb or action of the verb, where we got into categories like continuous and undefined, all those different ones. There are actually quite a diverse use of categories to among nominatives, among the use of the genitive and the dative and the accusative. But the basic use of the nominative is subject. The basic use of the genitive case in Greek is possession. The basic use of the dative case in the Greek is to indicate an indirect object. And the accusative, the direct object. So the dative there, we have these words to or for to the side because in English, think about an English sentence. I gave, I being the subject, nominative, gave is the verb. The book would be the direct object, so that's my accusative, to Tim. Okay, so there I'm adding the word to because it's the indirect object. The object was indirectly affected by the action that I performed. Each noun has two basic components. And so here we look at the word logos, which means word. It has a stem, log, and then again we're seeing these connecting vowels that we have seen in verbs as well. That omicron is the connecting vowel, which links that stem to the case ending, which again uh, there are paradigms, or what the word that we used earlier is that there are declensions, that patterns of declension that these nouns will follow based on whether they are first, second, or third declension. But these endings are going to tell us a lot about that noun. How is it functioning in the sentence? So whereas in English we followed word order, in Greek we're looking at the way that these words change their form. When we parse a noun in Greek, we're going to indicate these 5 things: case, number, gender, its lexical form, that is, how does that word appear in its basic form in the lexicon? Now, the lexical form is either going to be first, second, or third declension. It's either going to be masculine, feminine, or neuter in its lexical form. Okay, now some nouns are combinations of masculine and feminine when they go through their declension. So it gets a little bit interesting, but that is that occurs less often. But the main thing, and we will have access with BibleWorks to be able to find that out, right? What we know what word we're looking at. But the 5th element is inflected meaning. What does that word mean in its inflected form? Because it may mean, logos might mean word in as a subject, but it may have a different translation uh, if it was functioning in a different part of the sentence, right, as the indirect object. So there may be another word added like that, to or for a word or by a word. If it was, and so the inflected meaning adds, sometimes we'll add additional words to show how we're translating a particular word in its inflected meaning in a sentence. So again, singular, plural, and number. Here's something to know. Verbs agree with their subject in person and number. So if because we're going to have in the Greek language in a sentence that we're looking at, because words will be out of order, we kind of need to, we will go in and take our mouse cursor and go over that word and find out what its parsing is using BibleWorks. But then, so the nominative might be at the end of the sentence, right? If it was a predicate nominative, but the accusative might be earlier in the sentence. So we're going to have to put those in order. Well, the English translations have already done that for us, but what we want to do is be able to know, how did that happen, right? So we're learning enough Greek to know, how did that happen? Or what can I know from what BibleWorks is telling me if I add a little bit of extra grammar to it? And that's what this course is trying to provide you with. If the subject is not present, remember, the subject can be found in the verb. So here's an example, Mark 1:16. Kai paragon paratain thalasan. And going alongside of the sea, Tes Galileas, of Galilee. This is a genitive. So if we were looking at Mark 1:16 using BibleWorks, what we would find is that paragon is actually, while it has an omega nu, which often is genitive, this is actually a nominative participle, which we haven't even gotten to yet. But this sentence begins with a participial phrase with a prepositional phrase right there, alongside of the sea, para, tain, thalasan, a genitive of Galilee. Which sea? The Sea of Galilee. He saw, Aden. Okay, so here's a verb. So far we have not had a nominative noun to be the subject of this verb. And we would know, you could know that, even though you don't read Greek from sightseeing right now. You could look up Mark 1:16 in BibleWorks and go along and parse each word, or put your cursor over each word, and you would see that there is not a nominative noun. So this particular word has the subject embedded in it, and that happens quite frequently in Greek.